In a single week of the year 2023, Nigeria removed fuel subsidies and petrol prices jumped from roughly 200 naira per liter to more than 500 in many places. At the same time, the national currency collapsed, wiping out over a third of its value almost overnight. Within the first year, inflation surged past 30%, while food prices climbed even faster. This was not a war. This was not a natural disaster. This was a policy decision. So how did Africa's largest oil producer reach a point where fuel became a luxury, food turned unaffordable, and money lost meaning faster than wages could adjust? And when reform makes survival harder before it makes the economy stronger, what breaks first? To understand why Nigeria reached this breaking point, the story has to rewind to the system that existed long before inflation exploded. For decades, Nigeria ran its economy on two hidden pillars. The first was cheap fuel. The second was a controlled currency. Together, they created an illusion of stability in a country that exported crude oil but depended heavily on imports for almost everything else. Fuel subsidies were the most visible part of that illusion. Petrol prices were kept artificially low for years, not because fuel was cheap to produce, but because the government paid the difference. This made daily life feel affordable on the surface. Transport costs stayed low. Electricity generators remained viable. Food distribution relied on subsidized fuel to move goods across a vast country. But beneath that surface, the subsidy was draining public finances and distorting incentives. Smuggling flourished. Consumption rose. Investment in local refining collapsed. The second pillar was the exchange rate system. Nigeria did not have one naira. It had several. An official rate, secondary windows for selected sectors, and a large parallel market that reflected reality far more accurately. This gap rewarded insiders, punished exporters, and scared away foreign investors who could not move money freely. Dollars became scarce. Confidence eroded quietly. By the early years of the 21st century, these two pillars had turned from support into constraint. Fuel subsidies absorbed public resources even as government revenue struggled to keep pace. The central bank increasingly stepped in to fill fiscal gaps, expanding money supply and planting the conditions for future inflation. At the same time, the naira was defended at levels the economy could no longer sustain. Nigeria's oil wealth made this structure more fragile, not more secure. Oil revenue arrived in foreign currency, creating the belief that imbalance could be managed indefinitely. But production was volatile, theft was widespread, and refined fuel still had to be imported at global prices. The country earned dollars with one hand and lost them with the other. By the time the new administration took office in the year 2023, the choice was no longer whether to reform, but when. Maintaining subsidies meant bleeding public finances. Defending the naira meant burning reserves and freezing investment. Doing nothing meant slow erosion. Acting quickly meant shock. The decision to remove fuel subsidies and liberalize the exchange rate was framed as a reset. Painful but necessary. The assumption was that markets would adjust, investment would return, and short-term hardship would give way to long-term stability. What that assumption underestimated was how exposed households already were. When the supports were removed, there was no buffer left. In the next section, the analysis turns to the first and most violent shock of all, the moment the naira was set free, and why its fall rippled through every price, every contract, and every household in Nigeria. When Nigeria finally allowed the naira to float, the intention was clarity. One currency, one price, one market. What followed instead was a collapse in confidence so fast that prices had no time to adjust gradually. They jumped. For years, the naira had been held in place by administrative force rather than economic strength. Multiple exchange rates acted like pressure valves, hiding imbalances instead of resolving them. Importers queued for dollars at official windows that rarely delivered. Exporters were forced to sell foreign earnings at unfavorable rates. Foreign investors stayed away, not because Nigeria lacked potential, but because money could not move freely. Once those controls were lifted, the market did what it had been waiting to do. It repriced everything at once. The naira did not fall because traders panicked. It fell because the old price was never real. Years of suppressed demand for dollars surfaced in a matter of days. Businesses that depended on imports suddenly faced invoices that were dramatically higher. Contracts written in Naira lost relevance. Planning horizons collapsed from years to weeks. This currency shock transmitted into inflation with brutal efficiency. Nigeria imports fuel, food inputs, pharmaceuticals, machinery, and spare parts. Even locally produced goods rely on imported components or transport powered by imported fuel. When the Naira weakened, costs surged across the entire supply chain at the same time. There was no sector untouched. What made the shock worse was behavior. Once people believed the currency was falling, actions changed immediately. Traders repriced goods defensively. Households rushed to spend cash before it lost value. Credit shortened. Upfront payment replaced trust. Inflation became not just a result, but a survival strategy. Wages did not move at the same speed. Salaries are sticky. Contracts lag reality. Public sector pay adjusted slowly, if at all. This created a widening gap between prices and incomes, especially in cities where households depend on purchased food and transport rather than subsistence production. The central bank responded by raising interest rates sharply, aiming to restore credibility and slow inflation over time. But higher rates cannot reverse a sudden repricing of the entire economy. They work gradually. The Naira shock worked instantly. In theory, a weaker currency can boost exports and rebalance growth. In practice, Nigeria's non-oil export base was too small to absorb the shock. Manufacturing lacked scale. Infrastructure was fragile. Power supply was unreliable. The economy could not pivot fast enough to benefit from devaluation before inflation took hold. The result was a paradox. A reform designed to correct distortions instead exposed how deep those distortions had become. The Naira was freed, but the economy it represented was not ready to absorb the truth of its value. And just as households were struggling to adjust to a weaker currency, a second shock arrived, one that hit even faster and even closer to daily survival. If the Naira shock rewrote prices on paper, the removal of fuel subsidies rewrote life on the street. Fuel in Nigeria was never just another commodity. It was the backbone of daily survival. Petrol-powered transportation, electricity generators, water pumps, small factories, market stalls, and entire informal businesses. Keeping fuel cheap was how the state quietly subsidized everything else. When that support was removed, the effect was immediate and unforgiving. Pump prices jumped overnight. Transport fares followed within days. Commuting to work suddenly consumed a meaningful share of daily income. In cities, workers began calculating whether going to work was even worth the cost. In rural areas, moving goods to market became prohibitively expensive, shrinking supply and pushing food prices even higher. This shock moved faster than currency depreciation because it required no interpretation. People did not need to understand exchange rates to feel it. They felt it at the bus stop, at the generator, and at the market stall. Fuel costs spread through the economy like a tax on movement. Every step in the supply chain became more expensive. Trucks carrying food raised prices to cover diesel. Market sellers raised prices to cover transport. Households paid more for both food and electricity, often at the same time. The informal economy, which employs the majority of Nigerians, absorbed the shock directly. Small traders operate on thin margins and depend on daily cash flow. They cannot hedge fuel prices or absorb sudden cost increases. Many passed costs on immediately. Others shut down temporarily. Some never reopened. The timing amplified the damage. Subsidy removal arrived just as the Naira was weakening. Fuel imports were priced in foreign currency. As the currency fell, fuel became even more expensive to bring in. A fiscal reform turned into an inflation multiplier. The government argued that subsidies were unsustainable. They drained public finances, encouraged waste, and benefited wealthier households more than the poor. These arguments were not new, and they were largely correct. What changed was the moment they were acted upon. Relief measures followed, but they lagged behind reality. Announcements came after prices had already adjusted. Promises moved slower than markets. Inflation does not wait for coordination. What made this shock politically dangerous was visibility. Currency moves are abstract. Fuel prices are not. Every increase was posted in large numbers at stations across the country. Each change was photographed, shared, and remembered. Once fuel becomes expensive, nothing else remains cheap for long. As households struggled to absorb higher transport and energy costs, another pressure tightened simultaneously. The price of food, already rising, began to accelerate beyond control. Food inflation is where economic reform stops being theoretical. When prices rise in financial markets, expectations adjust. When food prices rise, behavior changes. Meals shrink. Nutrition deteriorates. Stress becomes constant. In Nigeria, this was the moment the crisis moved from macroeconomics into daily survival. Long before subsidies were removed or the Naira was floated, Nigeria's food system was already under strain. Agricultural productivity lagged population growth. Insecurity disrupted farming regions. Poor infrastructure made storage and transport expensive, even in stable years. Food was produced, but not cheaply, and not consistently. The shocks of the year 2023 turned these weaknesses into accelerants. Higher fuel prices raised the cost of moving food across long distances. A weaker currency raised the cost of fertilizer, seeds, packaging, and machinery, many of which were imported or priced in foreign currency. Even farmers growing locally felt the impact through more expensive inputs and transport. Food prices did not simply follow inflation, they ran ahead of it. Staples that anchored household diets became unstable. Grains, tubers, rice, cooking oil, fish, and meat rose rapidly. In urban areas, households dependent entirely on purchased food had no buffer. In rural areas, farmers faced higher costs without guaranteed higher incomes, especially where intermediaries absorbed margins. Food inflation also fed on expectations. When households believed prices would keep rising, they bought earlier and hoarded what they could afford. Traders responded by repricing faster. Markets stopped reflecting supply and demand and began reflecting fear. That fear reshaped daily life. Market prices changed frequently. Informal credit disappeared. Restaurants reduced portions or closed. Street food, once the cheapest option for workers, became unaffordable for many. Oil wealth offered no protection here. Nigeria exports crude oil, not food. Revenue flows through government accounts, not directly into household consumption. And when prices rise faster than incomes, even strong state revenues lose their stabilizing power. Food inflation also carried political weight. It is the most sensitive price in any society. Rising food costs erode legitimacy faster than exchange rates or fiscal balances ever could. They turn economic debates into moral ones. By the time relief programs were discussed, prices had already reset at higher levels. Inflation was no longer a temporary spike. It was embedded in expectations, behavior, and planning. As households struggled to keep food on the table, policymakers turned to their final instrument: monetary restraint. High interest rates, an attempt to slow inflation through financial pressure. But in an economy where most people do not borrow from banks, the question was never whether rates would rise. It was who those rates would actually reach. By the time inflation had spread through prices, Nigeria's policymakers were left with one remaining lever: interest rates. The logic was orthodox. When prices rise too fast, borrowing must become expensive. Credit must slow. Expectations must be anchored. This is how inflation is fought in textbooks and in advanced economies. Nigeria did not match that textbook. The central bank raised rates aggressively, pushing borrowing costs to levels rarely seen outside crisis economies. The intention was to defend the currency, signal discipline, and convince markets that inflation would not be tolerated. On paper, the response was decisive. In practice, its reach was narrow. Most Nigerians do not live inside the formal banking system. They do not borrow at policy rates. Daily life is financed through cash, family support, informal lenders, and rotating savings groups. For these households, higher interest rates did not reduce spending. Rising prices did. Formal businesses felt the tightening more directly. Manufacturers, traders, and small firms dependent on bank credit saw financing costs jump sharply. Expansion plans were delayed. Hiring slowed. Some firms reduced output altogether. Investment retreated just as inflation demanded more supply. This exposed a second paradox. Tight monetary policy aims to cool demand. Nigeria's inflation was driven mainly by cost shocks and scarcity. Food, fuel, and imported inputs were expensive because supply was constrained, not because consumption was excessive. Higher rates could not create more food or cheaper fuel. The currency responded more than prices did. Financial flows stabilized, speculative pressure eased, but consumer prices remained elevated. Inflation slowed only gradually, long after households had absorbed the shock. Credibility also mattered. Years of fiscal dominance had blurred the boundary between government spending and central bank policy. Markets watched not only interest rate decisions, but whether the state would resist spending pressures. Each intervention raised doubts about how long tightening would last. For households, monetary policy felt distant and abstract. What mattered was whether food prices stopped rising and transport became affordable again. High interest rates offered no immediate relief. Instead, they quietly reshaped behavior. Cash became central, credit retreated, inequality widened between those with access to finance and those without. Survival replaced long-term planning. In theory, monetary tightening buys time for reform to work. In reality, it revealed the limits of policy tools in an economy where informality dominates and confidence is fragile. By the end of this phase, Nigeria had used every major lever available. The currency had been liberalized, subsidies had been removed, interest rates had been raised. The remaining question was no longer which policy had been applied. It was how Nigeria's experience compared with other countries that faced similar shocks, and what consequences followed when reform collided with daily life. Nigeria was not the first country to experience inflation after reform, but it was one of the few to endure it at this scale, at this speed, and with this degree of contradiction. Across emerging economies, governments that liberalized currencies or removed subsidies faced short-term pain. What separated Nigeria from others was how many shocks arrived simultaneously and how little insulation households retained. In Egypt, currency liberalization also triggered inflation. Prices rose sharply, purchasing power fell, and living standards tightened. But the adjustment was paired with external financing, continued food subsidies, and strong administrative control over key prices. The state remained visibly present in daily life, absorbing part of the shock. In Ghana, inflation followed a different path. Currency weakness, rising debt, and fiscal stress culminated in a severe inflation spike and the loss of market access. The shock was devastating, but it followed years of deterioration and ended in an external rescue. Expectations collapsed before reform arrived. Nigeria's experience stood apart. The country was not in default. Oil revenues were still flowing. Reform was not imposed from outside. It was chosen. That made the outcome harder to accept and easier to contest. Among oil-exporting countries, the contrast was sharper still. States with domestic refining capacity or larger fiscal buffers were able to smooth fuel price adjustments over time. Nigeria exported crude oil but imported refined fuel, exposing domestic prices directly to currency swings and global markets. Oil wealth passed through government accounts without protecting household budgets. The consequences spilled beyond Nigeria's borders. For years, subsidized fuel crossed into neighboring countries through informal trade. When subsidies ended, that flow stopped abruptly. Transport costs rose across border regions. Informal economies contracted overnight. Motorbike taxis raised fares. Long-standing trade networks vanished. Inside Nigeria, the social impact followed familiar patterns. Urban households cut consumption. Rural producers faced higher costs without reliable price pass-through. Informal workers absorbed losses directly. Labor unions threatened strikes. Public frustration rose as daily expenses climbed faster than incomes. Inflation also reshaped politics. Economic debate narrowed. Long-term reform arguments lost credibility against immediate survival concerns. Each additional price increase became a political event, discussed not in technical terms but in moral ones. International investors responded cautiously. Some returned, attracted by a unified exchange rate and higher yields. Others waited, unsure whether reforms would hold under pressure. Confidence depended less on announcements than on consistency. Nigeria reached a critical juncture. Either inflation would slow, validating the pain as temporary, or it would harden into a new normal, turning reform into a warning rather than a success. The lesson extended beyond Nigeria. Reform is judged not only by balance sheets, but by whether societies can endure the transition. That left one final question. If Nigeria wanted reform without rupture, what would have to change next? By this stage, the debate in Nigeria had shifted. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary, it was whether reform could still succeed without fracturing society. The first requirement was stability. Inflation cannot fall if expectations remain unanchored. That meant maintaining monetary discipline long enough for households and businesses to believe prices would eventually stop rising. Consistency mattered more than speed. Any sign of reversal risked reviving defensive pricing and hoarding behavior. The second requirement was credibility in the currency market. A unified exchange rate only works if access is predictable and transparent. Businesses needed confidence that foreign currency could be obtained without sudden rule changes or informal barriers. Without that belief, pricing would remain cautious and inflation would stay embedded, but macro stability alone was insufficient. Reform without protection shifted the burden of adjustment onto those least able to bear it. That made social policy the third requirement. Cash transfers, food support, and targeted transport relief were not optional additions. They were core components of reform. Without them, inflation became politically unsustainable, regardless of economic logic. Timing mattered as much as scale. Support that arrived after prices had already reset did little to restore trust. For households, delayed relief felt indistinguishable from absence. The fourth requirement was supply. Nigeria's inflation was driven less by excess demand than by cost shocks and scarcity. That redirected focus toward agriculture, energy, and logistics. Expanding food production, easing transport bottlenecks, and stabilizing energy supply were the only durable ways to bring prices down. Fuel refining occupied a central position in this strategy. As long as refined fuel was imported, domestic prices would remain exposed to currency volatility and global markets. Local refining offered insulation, but only if it produced reliable supply and genuine competition. Two futures emerged. In one path, reforms held. Inflation slowed gradually. Food prices stabilized. Transport costs stopped rising week after week. The currency found a range rather than a cliff. Households adjusted. Pain became a chapter, not a condition. In the other path, reform fractured. Inflation lingered. Relief remained uneven. Policy discipline weakened. Confidence eroded again. The economy slipped into a cycle of partial reform and quiet reversal, repeating crisis under new labels. The difference between these futures was not technical. It was social and political. Reform succeeds when people believe hardship is shared and temporary. It fails when survival feels individualized and endless. That brought the analysis to its final moment. What Nigeria's experience ultimately reveals is not just how inflation happens, but how reform succeeds or collapses under pressure. Nigeria's inflation crisis was not the result of a single bad decision. It was the outcome of a system that postponed reality for too long, then confronted it all at once. Fuel subsidies delayed price signals. Exchange controls delayed currency adjustment. Monetary accommodation delayed fiscal discipline. Each delay softened the present and hardened the future. When reform finally arrived, it did not arrive gradually. It arrived as shock. The lesson is not that reform was wrong. The lesson is that reform without preparation shifts risk from the state to households overnight. In Nigeria's case, that shift occurred in a society where most people already lived close to the edge. Inflation did not only raise prices, it altered behavior. It changed how people planned, how they spent, and how they trusted. Trust in money weakened. Trust in policy thinned. The promise that sacrifice today would be rewarded tomorrow became harder to believe. History shows that economies can recover from inflation. What they struggle to recover from is disbelief. Once households adapt to instability as normal, growth slows, investment retreats, and reform loses legitimacy. Nigeria now stands between two paths, one where the pain of reform becomes a turning point towards stability and production, another where inflation becomes accepted, policy reversals return quietly, and the same crisis repeats under different names. The outcome will not be decided by interest rates or exchange regimes alone. It will be decided by whether reform is matched with protection, transparency, and credibility. For viewers watching this story, the lesson extends beyond Nigeria. Inflation is never just a statistic, it is a social force. When prices rise faster than incomes, they reshape behavior, politics, and belief. Understanding that process is not academic. It is essential. If you want more long-form analysis that explains not just what happened, but why it mattered, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and join the discussion, because the next inflation shock will not announce itself in advance.